Hi everyone, this is section 5 of chapter 17. What we're going to be taking a look at is interaction with hormones. So in the last section, what we talked about was how did the different hormones get transported around in the blood. We talked about lipid-soluble hormones and how they had to be put on a carrier or transport protein. And then we talked about water-soluble molecules and how those didn't need to have any kind of transport protein, how they were able to just freely go around in the bloodstream. So now where we are is, okay, the hormone has traveled around, and now we want to see what happens once it gets to its destination. Remember, its destination is going to be a target cell. So let's take a look and see what happens there. So we're going to take a look, and remember, because it's lipid soluble and because it's water soluble, they interact with their target cell very differently. So let's first kind of talk about hormone targets. So remember that hormones, when they leave the bloodstream, they come into contact with all types of tissue. Sometimes it doesn't even have its target, it's not its target cell, it doesn't have a receptor. So what does it do? It actually heads back to the bloodstream and starts traveling around again. But hopefully once it leaves the bloodstream, it has found a target cell which has its receptor on it, and then it can interact with it that way. Remember that each hormone is going to have different target cells. So example, prolactin, its target cell is a mammary gland. That's actually one type of tissue, and that is it. It's not just one cell, obviously, right? That means that only one cell in the body would be making milk. But it's that one type of tissue. But you have other hormones like growth hormone, like insulin hormone, that have several different types of tissues that it can interact with. So lots of different target cells that it can interact with. When it has a lot of different tissues and target cells that it can interact with, obviously it's going to have a wider influence over the body. And of course, we'll get into that later on when we actually talk about the effects of, prolactin and growth hormone and things like that. So let's take a look at the differences. What happens when it actually gets to its target cell. So let's say that you have this lipid-soluble hormone that's traveling around in the bloodstream. Remember, they have the carrier protein. And it leaves the bloodstream and it is going to find a target cell. Remember that it's lipid soluble. And if you remember what the cell membrane is, it's a biphospholipid. It's a phospholipid bilayer. Lipid-soluble hormones are relatively small. They're nonpolar. Perfect thing to go straight through that bilayer, right? So that's exactly what it does. It's kind of like it has a key to the house, and it can just open the door and walk right on in anytime that it wants to. And what it does is its receptors are going to be found on the inside of the cell. Its receptors are going to be found in the cytoplasm. Sometimes they're found inside of the nucleus. Sometimes they're actually found right on top of the DNA. So that's what it does. So all of the cells that we've been looking at so far, remember, they kind of look like this. We've been talking about, oh, look, there's one, there's a receptor like this. These are actually all water soluble. I don't know why it doesn't want me to make that receptor. It does not like that receptor at all. These are actually for water soluble. The ones that we were talking about. The ones for lipid soluble hormones, they are inside of the cell. So they're going to be the ones that are like inside like this. It does not want me to write at all. There it is. So that's what we're looking at here. It goes through, it binds on the inside, and then if it binds to a receptor in the cytoplasm, it actually goes and sneaks through into the nucleus, and then it binds to the DNA that way. And what happens is there's a change in transcription and translation, and what that does is that means it makes more protein. And really, depending on what the hormone is, it's going to determine what kind of protein it makes. It determines what kind of structural or metabolic effects it's going to have. And also, another thing is which cell it actually binds to, or what type of tissue it binds to. It's going to determine its actual effects. So if it's testosterone, and it goes through and it is going to interact with a muscle tissue, then it's going to cause it to make more muscle proteins. So that's what I mean by it depends on the hormone and it depends on the target cell on what it's going to do. So this is the easy one here, lipid soluble hormones. Let's take a look at water soluble hormones. Not as easy as we would like it to be here. A little bit more complicated. So with water soluble, they're going to be polar molecules. So that means they cannot cross the plasma membrane. They are going to be the ones that actually bind to those receptors on the outside of the cell that are embedded inside of the cell membrane, just like we are looking at right here. And they're the ones that we've been really looking at their target cells this whole time. So they're the ones that actually have to knock on the door. They can never go inside of that place that they're knocking on the door to. They have to pass the message on to all of these substances that are on the inside of this, I guess you can call it a house, right? So what it does is it, once the hormone, there's your water-soluble hormone, once it goes and binds right here to its receptors, we're going to talk about how it initiates this biochemical pathway, this signal conduction pathway. So the hormone acts as something called a first messenger, kind of like a postman or something. He wants to drop off a message to, a very important message to someone in the house. Say it's your kid that opens the door. It's like, nope, kid, don't let that person in the house, right? Just get the message, get that letter, and send it to your parents that way. So that's kind of how it works. So the hormone's going to be the first messenger. And then what happens is it is going to eventually lead to the formation of a second messenger. And really, it's the second messenger where a lot of the action is going to occur. There's a couple of different signal pathways that we're going to take a look at. We're going to take a look at adenylate cyclase activity, and then we are going to take a look at another one called phospholipase C activity as well. So they are both going to function through this thing called a G protein. And actually, the G protein was right here. So this thing is called the G protein. This is the first thing that interacts with the receptor. So you can kind of think as the hormone as the mail carrier. You can think of the, I guess the receptor is the door, and you can think of this G protein as your kid that is going in and answering the door. Hopefully it's not your 6-year-old or something like that that's opening the door, right? But that's what you can think of. So both pathways that I just talked about, that I just mentioned, that we're going to talk about in a second, are going to require this G protein. So as you can see, it's inactivated right now. It has something called a GDP on it. The DP means diphosphate. So really all a G protein is, it's going to be this protein found on the inside of the cell that has that binds a guanine nucleotide. That's basically it. If you don't want to know the specifics about it, you don't have to worry about that. So let's just take a look quickly at what happens. G protein is it binds to the activated receptor right here. There it is, activating. Then GDP heads on out of that little spot, and something called GTP is going to fit into that little spot. What GTP, triphosphate, what that does is it activates the G protein. And then what it means by activated, it actually is going to go down and move down the inside of the plasma membrane, and this is going to eventually result in the formation or availability of these second messengers that we are going to take a look at. So let's take a look at this first signal transduction pathway that I had mentioned earlier, adenylate cyclase. What happens is that activated G protein that we just looked at is going to turn on this other molecule called adenylate cyclase. What adenylate cyclase eventually does, you can kind of read it over here. Adenylate cyclase is eventually going to convert ATP molecules into something called a CAMP molecule. CAMP is actually the second messenger. where this whole kind of system, the second messenger system, gets its name. And then the second messenger, the CAMP, serves, what it does is it goes in and activates these different protein kinases. You can read about it a little bit more in the book. It goes in and kind of inhibits and activates different activities of the cell. Some of the hormones, a hormone that uses this is glucagon. Again, you don't have to worry about the little nitty-gritty details and what's happening in this whole second messenger system. I really want you guys to know, be able to link the second messenger system to water-soluble hormones. Make sure you know the two different signaling pathways. Here's one of them. We're about to talk about another one. Know which second messengers go with which one and what the G protein does. Other than that, don't worry about all the tiny little details that are going on. If you're interested in it, then the book goes into a lot more detail, especially in the next signaling pathway that we are going to look at. And it can get really interesting because a lot of medications and drugs and things like that work on this whole second messenger system to be able to go in and manipulate it and work on it that way. So it can, like Viagra works that way, works on this whole second messenger system. So it's pretty interesting. So let's take a look at the second the second signal transduction pathway, this phospholipase C. So what happens with the phospholipase C, we have that activated G protein that turns on a different molecule called phospholipase C. So it really just depends on what hormone it is. Glucagon is going to go in and turn on the adenylate cyclase. If this was oxytocin, then it's going to go in and activate the phospholipase C. So as you can see, a lot more complicated. What we have here is it's going to be two different second messengers. But that phospholipase C splits into something called PIP2. That is what PIP is going to be abbreviated for. So I like to say PIP2 a lot better than I want to say that word right there. That is a mouthful. But what that does is that PIP2 is going to split into two second messengers. Let's take a look at which ones they are. You have DAG, DAG, whichever one, and then you have the IP3 right there. And again, they are going to do different things as well. You can read about it a little bit more. You see how IP3 is going to go in and kind of manipulate some calcium release right there. But basically, let's talk about why this happens. Why in the world do we have to have this complicated system? And then we'll talk about what it does. So I'll go back to that. Why do we have this complicated system? It actually works really good because it amplifies the response. Each step that we have, each enzymatic activity is going to respond by forming more molecules that are going to be activated, and that is going to lead to an even greater response. So that's one of the big benefits of having the second messenger system, is this whole amplification that's going to happen. And also it's a lot better at being regulated as well. So let's go back and talk about some of the actions of water-soluble hormones. I mean, you gotta think about all the water-soluble hormones. There's going to be a lot of different things that it's going to do. I mean, you have growth hormone. Obviously, that's going to stimulate growth. It's going to stimulate mitosis. What else do we have? Enzymes are activated or inhibited. Cellular secretions can be released. Membrane permeability, maybe it opens up one of these, another ion channel. Muscles will contract or relax, like smooth muscles of the uterus or something like that. So lots of different functions, just depends on the hormone. So that's about it for our talking about how they interact with the cells. What we're going to talk about next time in section 7 is a little bit more some of the factors that are going to affect how cells are going to respond to those hormones. That's going to be the last section that we're going to talk about before we actually get into the different glands and talking about the different hormones and their effects. So until next time.